Good afternoon. I am Steve Swain, a professor of music here at Dartmouth College and the director of the college's Montgomery Fellows Program. We gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Western Abenaki, who were and are part of the Wabanaki Confederation. The Montgomery Fellows Program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place, of course, is Dartmouth College, but it is also the Montgomery House on Ockham Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. Our fellow today, the college's 268th resident fellow, comes to share with us her life and wisdom. I am diverging from my usual practice as director by continuing to stand here and introduce this term's fellow. My practice over the last 4 years has been to introduce a colleague of mine who in turn introduces the fellow. COVID, children, complications, and conflicts have thrown my usual practice onto the dung heap. But my colleague, Donald E. Pease, the Ted and Helen Geisel third century professor in the humanities and the founding director of Dartmouth's Futures of American Studies Institute, graciously provided to me what he would wish to say today had not a prior commitment called him away this afternoon. I'll do my best in delivering Dr. Pease's prose. The Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University, Hortense J. Spillers is a foundational figure in feminist theory whose writings have exerted a profound impact across the fields of American, African American, and Caribbean literary and cultural studies. From the field-defining works Conjuring, Black Women, Fiction and Literary Tradition, and Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in the Modern Text, to the landmark intervention, Black, White, and in Color, Essays on American Literature and Culture, Spiller's scholarship has played a major role in how contemporary scholars theorize race, class, gender, and sexuality, and how we understand the long reach of slavery and its legacies. In addition to awards from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, Spiller has served as a fellow at both the National Humanities Center in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, and the Center for the Study of the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto, California. In 2015, Professor Spillers delivered the W.E.B. Du Bois Lectures at Harvard. In 2017 and 2018, she received a Lifetime Achievement Awards from Callaloo and the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and for her groundbreaking work in philosophical literary theory, which spans the course of disciplines across the humanities and social sciences, Professor Spillers was inducted into the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences in 2021. Congratulations. Inventively capacious in their thinking, yet rigorous in argumentation, Hortense Spillers' essays have enabled generations of scholars to disentangle received knowledge from apparatuses of control within and outside the academy. Less concerned with pinning down Black life and culture to a word or a phrase, a typical Spillers essay is intent on articulating the complex historical, cultural, literary network that have shaped and continue to shape the contours of what she calls intramural Black life. Professor Spillers transformed Black studies through modeling rigorous engagement with theory. And she transformed theory by modeling serious engagement with the idea of Black culture. Each and all of Spillers' essays offers the contemporary moment a conceptual vocabulary and a literacy that appeal to effective understandings of social justice and freedom. However, the ongoing and unprecedented attention to Spillers' startlingly new explication of the physical and psychic terrain of Black women gendering in her 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book. And I'm curious how many of us have read that? That essay continues to be taken up by scholars in emergent interdisciplinary academic formations in what seems an ever-expanding legacy. The essay invented a transformational lexicon endowed with critical potential to alter the matrix of anti-Blackness underpinning the American grammar book. Notions like cultural vestibularity, the captive body, and ungendering have supplied structures of feeling and inaugural terms for scholars in decolonial studies, critical ethnic studies, Afro-pessimism, indigenous studies, race, migration, and sexualities, discourses, and more. Spiller says she wrote Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe with a sense of urgency. And I quote Professor Spillers: "You could never use the history or literature of Black people to explain something in theoretical terms. There was no discourse that the Black idea of culture generated in the mainstream academy that gave it a kind of recognition. The symbolic order that I trace in this writing, calling it an American grammar, begins at the beginning, which is really a rupture and a radically different kind of cultural continuation." End of quote. As the cadences of her essays attest, Professor Spillers is also a student of the tradition of African American preaching. The daughter of deacons of the Southern Black Baptist Church, Spillers reports that in her youth she had stored an infinite number of sermon performances in memory. Maybe we'll have a few of those today. The profound impact of that tradition on movements for Black liberation across American history informed Spillers' 1974 dissertation, Fabrics of History, Essays on the Black Sermon. Duke University Press will publish the revised version of this monograph that Professor Spillers plans to complete during her tenure here as a Montgomery Fellow. No pressure. You're clapping now, but I'm going to ask you to clap again. Please join me now in welcoming back to Dartmouth College, Professor Hortense Jean Spillers.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Steve Swain, for that wonderful introduction. You know, introductions are fabulous. You just kind of wish they would go on, right? That you wouldn't have to give your little piece after so many wonderful things have been said about you. Thank you so much for coming today. You could have been a number of other places, but you've come here, and I appreciate that very much. I also want to thank Professor Swain for whatever role he might have played in bringing me here as a Montgomery Fellow, and also to Professor Pease in his absence. I'm very sorry he couldn't be here today. And Professor Trika Keaton, is she in the audience? All right, there she is. Professor Trika Keaton and Professor Milich. I thank all of them for nominating me for this fellowship and for seeing to it that it happened. If I were going to write an intellectual autobiography, there may well be several places where I might start. But here's a certain seed that will hopefully bear fruit. When I was a girl of 7 or 8 years old last century, right? Members of my Southern Black Baptist congregation often visited other congregations, sometimes across denominations, but usually other Baptist churches, in an act of friendship and solidarity that reinforced a sense of ethos in a social and political context predicated on the social logics of Jim Crow, a race-based apartheid, and an inveterate police apparatus that assured it. But the social logics of Jim Crow attained its efficacy because it was meant to disable what it could neither anticipate nor neutralize, and that is to say, the countermands or revocations of natal culture, of my natal culture, and its soaring aspirations and dead-level certainty, which never abandoned it, and vice versa, that if his eye is on the sparrow, then for sure I know he watches me. In other words, Jim Crow has evinced its own mythemes, but these latter run asymptotic to a series of counter-narratives that Fabrics of History, the title of this talk, attempts to approach. Jim Crow, therefore, did not live on its own. It actually needed what it would destroy. In any case, during these visits across congregations, my minister would invite members who were not, for whatever reason, able to go see their host church to, quote, send go. The ministers always meant send money when they said send go, send money with their friends who were able to go. So years later, as I wrote about this practice, decades from the origin story, the send go acquired for me considerable resonance. It was not only the droll image in the mind of a snaggle-toothed 7-year-old, it was that too, which always provoked laughter in myself at this exact replica of me that wasn't me at all, but dissembled me to a T. But it also came to mean to stand for representability, the ways of surrogacy and substitution, of translation, transfer, displacement, the ways by which ego enters the world as its own other. This idea messes with notions of authenticity, perhaps, but for sure, it extends notions of how to think about or consider presence. If we intrude this idea or introduce this idea to certain Black cultural phenomena, to Black sermon rhetoric, for example, what kind of conceptual narratives might we be able to advance? Allowing the sermon to speak as an instance of historical apprenticeship, we grant to Black sermons the metonymic, synecdochic pride of place by which we suppose the putative journey from Africanity to Blackness might be traversed. W.E.B. Du Bois was among the first, if not the first, diasporic historian to posit African traces among the synthesis of forms that are situated in the confluence of what Du Bois called the religion of the American Negro. First published in The New World, a quarterly review of religious ethics and theology in December 1900, this essay constitutes Chapter 10 of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk 1903, 3 years after the essay is published. In attendance at a Southern Revival service, Du Bois, well over a century ago, assumes an anthropological stance that is both descriptive and axiological. In other words, he tells us what he thinks he is looking at the same time that by implication he assigns the unfolding scene of value. Scored by difference, the revival scene is made to stand in for class differences and differences that might be gathered under the rubric of the geographies of reason. This is the way he begins, or near the beginning of the piece. On a dark Sunday night, this service, far from home, far from my foster home, convey a sense of estrangement, intrude a note of the exotic. A country school teacher at the time in rural East Tennessee, when Du Bois was a student at Fisk University, Du Bois in this description declares his foreignness to the scene. Du Bois is fresh from the east of the United States, never having seen a Southern revival service before. Du Bois appears to stand so far away from the humanity that he confronts that it is as if the world he is describing laid hold suddenly of the precincts of fantasy and dream. Quote, a sort of suppressed terror hung in the air and seemed to seize us, a Piscean madness, a demoniac possession that lent terrible reality to song and word. The black and massive form of the preacher swayed and quivered as the words crowded to his lips and flew at us in singular eloquence. The people moaned and fluttered, leaping in the air, shrieking like a lost soul. Du Bois's gaunt-cheeked seatmate accompanies the wail and groan and outcry, and a scene of human passion such as Du Bois had never conceived before. Du Bois calls these religious practices the religion of the slave and defines it along three levels of stress: the preacher, the music, and what Du Bois calls the frenzy. For Du Bois, these characteristics of Negro religious life prevailed up to the time of emancipation. But well beyond that, Du Bois argued the Negro church of his day, on the cusp of a new century, in the 20th century at that, inscribed the social center of Negro life in the United States and the most characteristic expression of African character. Moreover, it was clear to Du Bois that the study of Negro religion is not only a vital part of the history of the Negro in America, but no uninteresting part, as he puts it, of American history. What Du Bois describes is essentially an enthusiastic religious form in the technical sense conveyed by its Greek etymology, from enthusiasticus, to be possessed by a god. This particular feature of Black religious experience, though modulated over the decades of the 20th century, remains what I would call the riddle of expression, if by that we mean what propels it, what provides its impulse. The Negro church disappears into the Black church, and the relative institutional autonomy of the latter remains one of the unsung heroic tales of late capital. And by that, I mean Black parishioners tend to take care of their churches and their ministers. This assertion, however, would have to be tested against the economic currents in which parishioners swim. But it is true that the Black church, as a social fact, has endured throughout the storm and stress of anti-Black backlash from post-Reconstruction to the present day. If Blackness inscribes the site at which and from which investment capital flees, then the miracle may be the church itself that tends to defy the odds against abandonment, aging populations, and even desegregation, which at mid-century induced the reorganization of Protestant churches across a broadened evangelical spectrum, a process that is still going on. In other words, as the American church has moved unabashedly closer to a corporate model that pursues profit as an aspect of Christian witness and organizes itself in ever larger economic units of religion as consumption, just as any other commodity is consumed, the American church is televised and mediatized. In a secular marketplace that gives free rein to the sacred in order to desacralize it. And it does so by exposing piety as a sham, as just one more dramatic prop. Against this background, the Black church likely proffers an alternative, which has always defined its destiny and becoming. From Frederick Douglass in the mid-19th century to critical practitioners like J. Cameron Carter, Ashton Crowley, and Sylvester Johnson, among others at work today, the Black church, with its multiplicities and contradictions, comes to stand as the chief bearer of critique, I would say, avant le left, precisely because it is open to history from below, represents and symbolizes the unhieratic or the unhierarchical impulses of the common man and woman, and allegorizes the confrontation of Black personality in its passage from the cultures and societies of the sub-Saharan African continent with the unknown content of the modern unspun world. We might think of the sermon then as the discourse of this transfer, transference, translation across, beyond, through. Sermon discourse not only addresses or poises itself in relation to the divine, but also does so in its own idioms of address. By refashioning, for example, biblical figures in resemblance to its audience, sermonic discourse in its Black manifestation might be thought of as a first-level mise en scene that activates and embodies voice and speech as the accomplishment of a drama beyond the particular world in which the delivery of the sermon arises. Do we wonder then that the sermon might well expand notions of reality, and moreover, in its performance demands, engenders a subject, actually creates an imaginative, thinking, critical subject who now encounters itself as a persona, as a repertoire of effects, as a kind of single. I have called the Black sermon the first poetry of the African diaspora, at least in my experience, and by that I mean to designate the organized channeling of feeling, indeed of being, into a language that aspires to express the range of human emotion. Not only religious devotion or piety, but an interrogation or critical inquiry of a world that enforced notions and practices of containment and constraint in relationship to African personality. I am suggesting that communities cut off from scholarship and learning, and often literacy itself, as was the case of a 19th century minister, John Jasper, in 19th century Virginia. These figures were thrown back on the resources of imagination. But what begins as necessity, because laws and practice dictated it, proceeds as tradition. In other words, a preacher like John Jasper, famous for a sermon entitled "The Sun Do Move," is memorialized in the archives as a folk hero, as the defunct inscription of a closed era. But what makes stylistic and generic comparison possible? What would affect recognition between sermonic discourse of Jasper's era and the coeval Black sermon is what Ashton Crawley in Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, published a couple of years ago, calls the emergence of alternative modes of social organization, signaled by the shouting, the speaking in tongues, and other sonic noises of the Black Pentecostal Church. The sermon conduces to these effects of the ecstatic, or what J. Cameron Carter calls the anarchy of Black religion, by which Carter does not mean of politics alone or even foremost, but an excess of meaning, he tells us, beyond ontology. Black religion, he argues, is made up of practices premised on an alternate imagination of matter, as he plays on mater, mother, matter, so forth. So he claims to propose here an elaboration of Black religion as what he calls a sociophysics of difference without separability. The distance between an analysis of Jasper's sermons 50 years ago and the contemporary reading of Black religious expression measures precisely the extent to which Black personality has gained access to scholarship and learning, and between an analysis of Jasper's sermons and Jasper's world, an enormous difference intrudes itself. And within that passage, the clarification of the goals of liberation and movement toward it. It is the kind of narrative in its triumphal character that the sermon repertoire would capture. From that point of view, the sermon gathers exegetical and theological elements in a repertoire of strategies whose central form is the narrative and whose end is cathartic release. In that regard, the sermon proffers an instrument of collective catharsis, binding once again the isolated members of community. It is no small fact, nor can it be overstated, I think, that the civil rights movement in the United States partially owes its effectiveness to the resources of the Black sermon. Though sermon style was displaced onto political speech and the purposes of political speech. Martin Luther King's quite remarkable addresses, which we well know, and no less the powerful appeal of Malcolm X's speeches, both as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam and even beyond his career as a Black American Muslim. If the sermon then has evolved into a discrete form, neither wholly African in its character, nor wholly Protestant West, but rather what we might call a catholicity of elements that combine musical patterns, including jazz-like syncopation and blues overview, idiomatic patterns of speech, elements of drama and performance, and surefire oratorical power. In our radically revised and corrected gender practices and ideologies, we no longer repose in the awesome sound of the Father's voice, and no longer repose in a belief in the awesome sound of the Father's voice, but it is likely no mistake that in the popular imagination, a black preacher is male, and the chief actor of black sermon form a man. I've known a few quite powerful black women orators, among them Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, among the most celebrated of them, but only in our era will we find a growing number of women preachers. One wonders if there is, however, a believed correlation between the commanding sound of a male voice and the authority that is felt to be inherent in sermons. The audience of the sermon is one of the most crucial features of its performance and aids the enactment of the concept of the fourth wall with inimitable and choreographic exactitude. For one thing, the architecture of many small Protestant churches lacks the elaborate design elements of the hieratic church, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, and so forth. The spaces that separate the nave, for example, from the pulpit or the chancel and the choir are often foreshadowed in these little churches. I grew up in one, so that one's overwhelming impression is the sense of adjacency and intimacy. In other words, in such congregations, one is very close to her fellow parishioners. In this foreshortened space, the pulpit is central, but the distance between the minister's location and the pews, slight to begin with, actually collapses in the course of the sermon. The call and response between audience and preacher induces the sermon climax, in which case the preacher is not only liberated, as it were, from whatever text he might have had at his disposal, but in some cases from the ordinary or standard patterns of speech that the preacher has attended in the unfolding narrative that the sermon proposes. Members of this audience will likely recall Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech delivered 60 years ago, this year, I think, with the Lincoln Memorial in the background. As Coretta Scott King tells it in one of her early memoirs, My Life with Martin Luther King, King essentially abandons the text in front of him when he enters the "I Have a Dream" portion of the speech. We also note with interest that speech and sermon in King's case, and in the case that I'm looking at, all the cases that I mean, speech and sermon are much the same, and the relationship is an analogous instance to blues, for instance, that might, with a slight change of wording, fit the church as well as the world. In any case, what we pay attention to in the record of King's address is the intensification of call and response between King and audience, a quickening and vivification of the rhetoric of the speech. Passages in anaphora, for instance, which is one of the most amazing figures of speech that in itself alone might conduce the rhythms of climax. And this is several phrases strung together that begin with the same word. For instance, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and the Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied. And there's several such passages in that speech, as you will recall. For those who are 100 years old like myself, you will recall this. The audience response to passages like this evinces both an increase in the volume of the sound, and I suppose we could say to the quantity of participants and participation. By the time the speech reaches its climactic moment, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, the audience already on its feet explodes in joy from what I would call, with Edmund Wilson, the utter shock of recognition. A shared field of allusion throughout the speech to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, patriotic anthems, Black spirituals, all incorporated into aspirational discourse concocted by King's figural imagination. In some cases, the preacher, as he also encounters a dismantled fourth wall, so to speak, leaves the syllabic contours of his words as the latter grope toward music. It is not an accident that the traditional Black sermon often ends in singing, as the preacher occupies a kind of interstitial locale or location or a threshold with the signifying chain of the spoken word on one side of him and the phonographies of agitated layers of air on the other, the grunts, screams, moans, groans of a vocal frisson that is akin to the language of music. In this zone of dissolution, which identifies what we could call a crisis of degree, hierarchy, either express or implicit, disappears as subjects arrayed along class lines and lines of status, degrees of education, what one does for a living, even skin tones, body image, fashion sense, now confront each other at the place of a newfound equity and belonging. It is clear to me that this breaking out of a democratic intention has brought the members of this congregation together, at least for now, and perhaps not for long, in a repeatable vision of what the late John Lewis was moved to call the beloved community. The sermon assures that the experience is repeatable. It will happen all over again, and that is an aspect of its magic. It will happen next Sunday and the Sunday after that, and pretty much in the same way, and that's a part of the thrill of it. And you wonder, well, how can that kind of repetition bring something thrilling? I have something, it's not exactly naughty, but I've often thought of the climactic moment of the sermon, not unlike the sexual act, right? That it's the repetition of the form, right? The repetition of ritual patterns. And I think, by the way, it will not be remarked in many places. It might not be remarked anywhere but here. That I think that kind of gets into part of the appreciation of the form, right? Okay. And it is by way of this achieved social cohesion that the sermon enables renewal and belonging in intersubjective play and exchange. To what extent does sermon form mark an instance of cultural continuity, or does it? I am of the opinion that the jury may still be out on that particular question, as is the case with a few others. And why is that? Well, for one thing, the realignment of African American community along different levels of stress. By that, I mean that the social mapping dictated by racial segregation and apartheid is not exactly the same as it was when King delivered I Have a Dream. The economic and material circumstances of the Black life world are infinitely more complex than I can possibly describe in short order. But if we take hold of a single thread of a modicum of success, we might look at Black academe with its mixed outcome. What we can say for sure is that Black personality now inhabits often enough uncustomary loci: presidential, vice presidential, gubernatorial office, corporate affiliation, wider media exposure, etc. So these shifting of positions and status would impel, as we might imagine, new habits of practice and belief, including ways of worship, if worship at all, where one attends church, if at all, demands from an audience for a better educated clergy, and so forth. But as important, if not more so, than these sociological signals are the ontological ones, the ontological cues and signals that gesture toward what I would call a revised internal geography of feeling. I suppose that my sensitivity to these currents of engagement is fairly acute because I've spent the prime time of the last 5 decades of my life in a classroom, in lecture halls like this one, and I have caught what seems to me the sounds of a new accent, or we might say with Frantz Fanon at the close of Black Skin, White Masks, the putting afoot a new man. It is my sense that this eventuality is quite a lot less remote today than it was at my birth. Or could we even say prior to the Obama presidency? What I'm getting at is that the answer to this question acts like a kind of torque in my own intellectual autobiography, the place at which things begin to rotate again. My friends are Truman Capote Award winners and know the canons of many traditions of philosophy, art, music, photography, architecture, the dramatic arts, the marvels of the cuisine, and have traversed the globe, if not yet outer space. So what is their desire? I suppose I should add my name to the chorus. In the singing of my own heart, in my own heart, a minor chord hangs loose in the dead of night. I watch in my mind's eye a corner turning from the horrors of enslavement and servitude to the daylight of self-owning and the dignity of freedom's dreams. Perhaps I remember that snaggletooth 7-year-old, the sound of my father's voice, my mother's face, and the beautiful young adulthood in my siblings. In short, the holiness of the heart's affections, as John Keats puts it. In short, the other me from analysis and conceptual landscape is a little bit poet and preacher. If I'm not mistaken, these tokens of memory, of becoming, of the fuel to the scholarly trails out from the prayers and sermons incorporated into our living now. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Spillers. Steve Swain here on a roving mic. We have time for questions. If you will raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you so we can record you on both audio and video. So, I should mention that we will give priority to students. So are there any questions or comments? There's a mic over there on that side as well.
Hi.
Hi, Michaela.
If you could stand, that would also help us. Thank you.
You said that the Black sermon functions as the first Black poetry. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering where you fit Phyllis Wheatley's poetry into the legacy of the sermon.
Didn't expect that. In the legacy of the sermon, I suppose if I said that, I don't want to say that there is no distinction or difference because Phyllis Wheatley is officially a poet. But I think I see in Phyllis Wheatley's journey and what she was up against in having to acquire validation from outside herself, that that's the kind of story that the preacher is really designed to valorize, and it's in that valorization, I think, that looks poetic, right? I mean, it gives a poetic value to those subjects that are elsewhere devalued, and I think to that extent, the poetic project and the sermon project are really quite similar or complementary. I would say it that way.
Hi, I'm a graduate student. Even though I don't look like a student, I am one, so I'm not queue jumping. I was interested when you brought in the mention of the Obama presidency and how you see the talk coming there and that arc of history. And I'm wondering, tying together with what you'd said about Martin Luther King Jr. and how he used the rhythms and the sermon of speaking in his political speaking. I've always been very fascinated by Obama's speech at the wake, the Amazing Grace speech. Mm-hmm. And when you talked about how the sermons often end in music, and he did that, did you see some of these rhythms of the sermon coming through in his political speaking?
That's a really good question. And I would, how to put this? I think Obama was aware of what would appear to be spontaneous. I don't think it actually was. Plus, he was out of tune when he did that. So, I would say that he's a very clever man, very brilliant man. God bless him. I'm glad we had him. But he was aware, let me put it this way, of Blackness as the kind of repertoire that one could appropriate, and he did it beautifully. And so I think that's what was going on there. the pulse of my nerve always tell me when it's authentic, when it's real, when it's really coming across. I can always tell. I think I can mostly tell, and I think that was it was a very important moment. Mother Bethel Church in South Carolina, but I think he knew, he was very aware of his audience, that it would be an all-Black audience, at least in that church. And so I think that was designed for that particular moment, rather than the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, as the Romantics put it.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Jasmine.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could speak just a tiny bit more about the relationship that you see between the Black sermon and the blues, and specifically, this is a little bit of a selfish question because I'm a huge fan of August Wilson, and I'm really interested in what he does in his dramaturgy around the blues and the collectivizing action around memory that he uses the blues to do within the Pittsburgh cycle. But August Wilson is really clear within all of his work, right, that that any sort of gesture towards Christianity as a memory practice or as a freedom practice is the wrong way to go within his works. And so I'm kind of curious within that lens, if you could speak about the relationship between the blues and the Black sermon.
Okay. Well, let me start this way. I think of the blues as a kind of poor man's philosophy, right? That, you know, it's the place where one broods about the world, and I would say that from that point of view, the Black sermon, in its elegiac character, in its brooding character, in its meditative character, does something like the blues, right? I think it is probably a matter of great interest to me that a figure like Thomas Dorsey played the piano for Bessie Smith, but then he also wrote some of the most profound and moving church music that we know. Precious Lord, Take My Hand is written by Thomas Dorsey. Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin could go either way all the time. Sam Cooke. I mean, these people, you hear them in the world, and you can take that very same song, changing the words, to church. I mean, it's absolutely insane how that works. But it seems to me that it's a streak of genius in the way the religious impulse and the blues impulses are working in that way. I mean, they're absolutely adjacent and complementary, and they work hand in hand, and they are a way, I believe, of expressing one's profoundest feelings about the world without having high degrees and a lot of training, that they both open the world up in a kind of way.
Other questions? Adedouin looks like he has a question. Please stand, Adedouin.
Okay. So thank you very much for the talk. This is a compliment to the last question. Could you talk about, I have noticed sometimes with sermons, as they become musical, an instrument like the organ becomes the response to the preacher, or a piano. In your talk, you talked about syncopation in terms of the musicality of the sermon itself, but could you speak to how an organ becomes the response to the sermon, or a piano? In other words, musical instruments apart from the voice. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's one of those resources that I was talking about earlier. And it's hard to explain, but it's quite beautiful to watch. I think one of the best performers that I have seen in that regard is Aretha Franklin's father, C.L. Franklin. And C.L. Franklin is in this writing about sermon style. And at some point, I mean, it's in that exchange that happens in the audience that the next stop or the next place to go after the sermon is over. And the sermon, in some ways, the sermon does not end, right? I mean, it just goes someplace else. And that going someplace else is the music that it often assumes, right? So that I have seen it happen that the preacher actually stops using words and it simply sounds, and it sounds in a certain harmony, right? That's why an improvised pianist who can do improvisation is so vital in these church services, right? Because I have seen very gifted people sit at a piano or an organ, and whatever sound comes out of the preacher's mouth, they just hit it on the organ or on the piano. And I've seen that just take a congregation someplace else. So it's just, we call it ecstasy, or the standing outside the self. I've actually seen that happen in those moments, right? So that, music is very much the continuation, the elaboration, the extension of speech. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm Professor Shayante Allen in the sociology department, and I study the intersection of race, religion, and politics. So I really appreciated the framework that you offered us about sermons as a sociopolitical artifact. But as a sociologist, I'm trained to situate everything in a particular context. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how we should be thinking about the perceptions of sermons shifting over time, especially in this moment where we're seeing lots of research on religious affiliation decline, church attendance decline. And so, just thinking kind of about the framing of the sermon as both sacred and secular, and how we might think about that, and how you're thinking about that as you revisit your dissertation and our understandings of church and religion and society have shifted. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's the $64 million question, right? How to answer that. I think that, and I found out preparing this talk that just what you described there is going to be problematic for me in getting through. How do you explain a form that has become over time more performance than anything else? One of the problems that I have with gospel music today is that everybody is a quote star. Right, and so what they're doing is performing, and you can tell that they are more concerned about how they're coming across in the performance than whatever feelings they might be conveying. So that it seems that when you talk about religious expression today, and particularly the sermon you're talking about, as I said in the talk, a commodity, right? So how do you how do you make that available to an audience if you're saying that this form has some validity still? And I've decided that it might be that its value is psychoanalytic, that it provides a systematic, not it itself, but the effects of sermonizing, right? That the sermons belong to a pattern of experience that really is, as I said before, another me. It's another side. It's yourself when you are not in the grips of an analysis. I mean, it's simply that self that we call it a divided self or another self. I think the sermon participates in those precincts. So it's a feeling tone, I think, a structure of feeling that the sermon is a part of and contributes to, that fills out personality, that enriches personality, and that's what I would say. That if I can find the terms to address it as a kind of psychoanalytic translation, I think that's its value, right? It's that subjective sense that we have.
Hello. Hi, I am a graduate student, Priscilla Agbo, and I would love to hear you talk more about the alchemy in the intersection between African or Black indigenous, spiritual practices like hoodoo, juju, voodoo, cymatics, because, just the physics of it. And it's almost like it's a sense of entering another body, I'm thinking mancy, like a spiritual mancy, entering another and gaining control. And I just would love to hear you talk more about that, just that dynamic happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you help me, how do we talk about that? I think the West didn't know how to talk about that experience. And I think you can see that in Du Bois's words. What he is describing is something exotic and that he really didn't have a good sense of. And I think that points to its non-Western origins, right? And so I think we are still evolving a vocabulary that does exactly what you are describing, or what you would like to hear, and that is, how do you talk about those dynamics? I'm thinking about a text by Colin Joan Diane, Haiti, History, and the Gods, and she talks about aspects of voodoo religion in the Haitian context. And what she points out is that the forms of religious expression that diasporic Africans evolved were really syncretic forms, that they fall between traces of African ritual and Catholicism. And that it's that combination that gives us the synthesis. And so that's what I think that's what's difficult to describe, right? Because you're talking about choreography, phonographies, being someplace else other than in the body. And I think those of us who have had, well, you've had experiences like that, right? I'm thinking about, well, or something kind of like that. When I could play a piano, I could do it for hours. I have arthritic hands now and can't really play a piano, which is a real shame. But I can remember sitting at the piano for hours and just simply going someplace else. I was not there. I was elsewhere. And then you come back. Now that's a pretty simple thing. I mean, it's not a big deal, right? I mean, we all have those experiences one way or another where we get outside our mundane selves, our usual standard selves, and go someplace else. And I think that's exactly what's happening in these choreographies that you're describing, right? That gets in the confluence between African elements and New World elements.
Was there another question in that row of students? Okay, Mike, if you'll get the microphone over to there. And please stand if you will.
Hi, Professor Spillers.
Hi, Mac. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It has put me to tears. It's absolutely beautiful because I love the sermon so much. My question relies in the idea where you're talking about the sound of the sermon or the sonic principle of the sermon itself. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know more about the frenzy and the wail, and if we can participate in the ideas of Mahalia Jackson and also Aretha Franklin, that idea of the wail and how it operates within memory and death. I was hoping that you could explore more of that for me.
Yeah. Well, what to say about that? I'm seeing Mahalia Jackson's face now in Come Sunday, and how she really takes that journey someplace else that I was talking about a moment ago. That's why somebody like Cameron Carter and the kind of arguments that he's making in what he's calling the anarchy of Black religion, I think that's what they're getting at. I mean, in other words, these sounds, screams, yells, grunts, moans, groans, they go all the way back to what Frederick Douglass in the 1845 narrative identifies when he talks about the sorrow songs. And his recollection is that those songs that really became the spirituals sometime later, that you would find in those noises made by those figures who had sometimes been dispatched with the message to the big house, that you would find in those moments probably the most vivid description of what enslavement had done to personality, that you could hear it in the tunes that came out. And they came from people who were not trained in music or not trained in anything. So that to a certain ear, those are simply noises that don't mean anything. But then when you introduce them to a certain context, I mean, when Aretha Franklin, for instance, screams in her music, I mean, it makes a certain kind of sense to me. I mean, somebody else listening to it would say, what is that? What's that about? Or what is that for? I think Western communities probably looked at those sounds very often and thought that this doesn't make any sense, or it is coming from an unlearned place, or an unreasonable place, or irrational place. But then to claim that as a meaning and a value, which is what somebody like Jay Cameron is doing, is a very interesting thing to watch. And what it generates really is a different anthropology, a different way of listening, a different concept of what noise is and what music is, what's possible with musical forms, or with noise itself, right? As somebody put it, I think it was Marx, talking about language, agitated layers of air. Yeah.
I see another student has the microphone right now. Will you stand?
Hello.
Hello, Florent.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It was fascinating. I like the parallel you made between the architecture of Baptist churches and Anglican churches, if I understood correctly. And I'm very much interested in the link between architecture and social and cultural geography. So my question is, do you think the architecture of Baptist churches plays a role in the frenzy of the performances of the sermons? And if yes, do you think this role is central or not?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I've often thought about that, and it's probably true that the proximity of members of the audience to one another plays a role in an outcome, right? That the distances that have been foreshortened or closed, in fact, bring people together in ways that might not happen, say, in St. Paul's Cathedral. I remember going to hear a reading of John Donne's poetry in St. Paul's, a visit to London some years ago, and it occurred to me that the person who was speaking was 3 blocks away. And it was like, huh? So the great churches, the bigger the churches, I think the greater the distance between parties and principles are. So that I think that the architecture, the architectonics is certainly a feature of the way people respond to each other, to what they're hearing. I mean, for instance, if you are in a theater, sitting next to people, or in a concert hall, close to people, you respond really quite differently if you're surrounded by people rather than people scattered in an audience. I'm not really sure how that works or why it works, but it seems to me that magically it is so. That our sociality demands, or our sociality dictates that we are responding to each other all the time, and the closer, I think that matters. It actually does matter.
And I know that there are other questions that people want to ask, but Professor Spillers will be here at the front of the room for those of you who didn't get to ask your questions. Thank you again, Professor Spillers, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.